Hi guys. So the book that I chose for one of the last two book discussions was Parlor Politics, in which ladies of Washington helped build a city and a government by Catherine Al Gore. And the quote that we're looking at for this book is, ultimately the story of the Washington women profoundly changes the political history of the early republic. And I think that is very much the argument that she is making in this book throughout the chronological setup, that she argues for these women having a higher purpose in the politics of Washington. And one of the quotes early on that I liked was on page 9, and it says, "Women were everywhere in Washington City. The mixed and contradictory evidence about the presence of elite white women at any given time stems from the cyclical nature of their presence. There always remained a steady core of female residents, both official and local, but most women came to Washington for the social reason." And I think that ultimately stems from what she said on page 2 about this ever-growing population of women in Washington that we haven't been taught necessarily in schools, and it should be more known about. And in this book, it very much highlights how much power that these women, like she highlighted, for instance, Martha Washington, Catherine Louisa Adams, or Dolly Madison. You see this ever-changing dynamic of how much power these women held, and the kinds of narratives that they used, their own individual desires to appear in politics, in the public and social well-beings of the nation. And so I think starting out, I wanted to talk about how in the beginning she talks about, in the President Jefferson chapter, about Martha Washington in particular. She very much used her power, or her voice rather, and she decided, as being the First Lady, she wanted to have these social gatherings and these dinners to really illustrate the power that these dinners could have. And these dinners held that men and women could come together and talk and explore and talk about politics. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a place of men, although they were used for George Washington to talk with his diplomats and other prominent men in Washington. But she also allowed for, she let women come into this space and talk about their own ideas with these men. And that, in a sense, gives a more, more diverse way of what we would think of these dinners and social gatherings. In a sense, these social gatherings equated to political gain, and you see that she talks about how even Jefferson hosted these dinner parties. And I think that's really reflective of, I don't know if he really, in a sense, drew from how she hosted these dinners, but it was Jefferson. And so she talked about how he was a very much Republican man in believing that women should have their own place in the domestic world rather than in the political sphere. And so I don't think he would give credit to Martha Washington for hosting these dinners in a way that she did to politically connect people, but he did, in a sense, again, go about that way in creating a sphere very much representative of what Martha had done. And you see also that Dolly, in a sense, also had done that in her, under the presidency that her husband had. She also hosted these dinners, and it again reiterates the diversity that she wanted. And she also brought in families, and she really wanted to create an environment where everyone could be enjoined together and talk about politics or whatever was going on in the daily lives of Americans during the 19th century. And so I think another aspect I want to talk about was the fact that Dolly Madison, she also wanted to redesign the president's house, and she used her political power in redesigning this house. And I think this Catherine Al Gore reiterates this style and this power behind imagery, and I think that's very true of what these women did. And you see that representative of what Dolly Madison did in the president's house in designing it to become a Greek-inspired style of architecture. And on page 61, it talks about the Oval Drawing Room, site of Mrs. Madison's Wednesday evenings, constituted one of the most elaborate interiors in early 19th century America. Here, Dolly's nationalist mission asserted itself more aggressively, and you see that in Jefferson, he inspired that English style, and Dolly Madison really wanted to illustrate the Greek-inspired authenticity of the democracy and this Republican feel, and she felt that the White House should really be a very representative of, because it's where the president resides, it should be a place of a very nationalistic approach, and recreate a Republican society. And so I think that in showing that style pop up and that imagery, it reiterates that you see these women using their different avenues of reflecting how much they use their political voices in the politics of the early republic. And another last thought I wanted to discuss was that you see these women in Washington on page 145. The experiences of women in Washington differed from those of women in other cities because the unprecedented freedom of movement the city offered. In every American city and small town, wherever the family business was politics, elite and middle-class white women participated, but the knowledge Washington women gained from their public lives made them much better players. And she reiterates that kind of statement over and over again, and I think within each chapter it felt like she was reiterating the fact that Washington in particular was this case study or an example of women in particular at that time, because they were in the national capital, that they were given more opportunities than other women, and it showed that, especially in the founding, in these leading ladies, that they had those opportunities, and they did go ahead and use that that chance to show that women could have their political voice, even though men may not have wanted to. And you see that when later on under Jackson's administration, you see the Margaret Eden affair happen, and you see that I liked how she demonstrated that up until that point, society was very much very open to women being in politics, but then you get to the Jackson administration, and you see how this woman, she kind of steps a little too far, and in her political power, and I guess in a sense, and even though she's not a very prominent political figure, it shows that you see this woman who there's rumors going around and all this and about this private affair, and it becomes this huge public ordeal. And I think in a lot of ways, Catherine Al Gore highlights that both men and women at that time, at this point, felt that after this affair, it kind of changed some of the ways that how women were viewed. And although there were women still wanting to be political and be very voiced in their opinions, you still had local ladies on page 231 that, led by Margaret Bayard Smith, that denied that their participation in politics had ever been political or public. And you see these more local women who were kind of were not always in favor of women being in politics. And this affair really hammered down on what they were saying, that women don't really need to have a public life outside of their own individual lives. But then you also have on the other side that administrative wives, they were even not wanting to talk about this affair, and that in a sense led to kind of them taking a step back a little bit in voicing their opinions, although you still see this political involvement with them later on in other presidencies down the line. But you still, I think due to that affair, it really did affect the way political women in Washington especially design their own motives in wanting to become a political figure in Washington. And so I think, looking back at that quote and looking at this book, I think she really did a good job of discussing how much of a more powerful role that women had in Washington at that time of the early republic. And I really liked how she chronologically put it, and how these different women use different aspects of their own ways of political advancing themselves, but they also used it in a way that didn't take a step back from their husband's own career, but they really wanted to display that women had a voice, and they had their own interests and their own social desires to create a Republican-built government. And although you had this affair that happened at the end of the book, it really reflects the impact that it would take so much longer for women's rights. And although I don't know if women kept going and voicing their opinions more often, it might have changed that dynamic of how fast women's rights were given to them. And I think this was a great book to discuss the issues that went on with the wives of these prominent men, and also the local women who we don't always I've never heard of, or I've never been affiliated with within these political talks. And so I look forward to reading the rest of your discussions, and I hope you all have a great week.